On the night of February 16, 1944, 60,000 German soldiers charged into a blizzard, shouting, "Hurrah!" and brandishing bayonets, not toward victory, but into what survivors would call Hell's Gate, where Soviet cavalry would hack them down with sabers, and more than 1 in 3 would die in the snow. This was Korsun-Cherkassy, the forgotten little Stalingrad that warned of catastrophes to come. This battle demonstrated everything that would make the Soviet Union unstoppable in 1944. Marshal Zhukov coordinated massive encirclements across multiple fronts. Hitler refused to let his armies retreat until escape became impossible. And when 60,000 trapped men finally tried to break free, they ran straight into a medieval nightmare of cavalry charges and artillery fire that killed 20,000 soldiers in a single night. 4 months later, the Soviets would use these exact same tactics at Operation Bagration to destroy Army Group Center and kill or capture 450,000 German troops. Korsun-Cherkassy was the warning. Bagration was the catastrophe. And between them lies one of history's most damning questions. Why did no one learn the lesson written in blood and snow? By January 1944, the Soviets had learned the lessons of Stalingrad. Now they were ready to teach them. The German 8th Army occupied a substantial bulge in the line northeast of Cherkassy, along the Dnieper River. Military planners call these bulges salients. They offer defensible terrain and forward positions. They also create opportunities for encirclement. The Germans saw the first advantage, Marshal Georgy Zhukov saw the second. On January 24, 1944, Zhukov coordinated something unprecedented, a multi-front pincer operation that deployed 400,000 Soviet troops, 500 tanks, and 5,000 guns against the vulnerable German salient. The Second Ukrainian Front under General Ivan Konev attacked from the north and west. Simultaneously, the First Ukrainian Front under General Nikolai Vatutin attacked from the east and south. This was not a simple assault. This was operational-level warfare, the coordination of separate armies across hundreds of miles to achieve a single strategic objective. The scale revealed how far Soviet capabilities had advanced since the desperate days of 1941. 5 complete ground armies moved in concert. At least 1,000 aircraft provided support. The numerical disparity was crushing. 400,000 Soviets against 60,000 Germans trapped in the salient. These were not the force ratios of equals trading blows. These were the numbers of an industrial giant that had learned to deploy overwhelming power with surgical precision. The jaws snapped shut with shocking speed. Just 4 days after the offensive began, on January 28th, the 2 Soviet fronts joined near the village of Zvenegorodka. Along the Niloy-Tikich River, 6 German divisions, 60,000 men, found themselves trapped in a roughly circular pocket centered on Korsun. The encirclement tempo demonstrated the operational doctrine that made Soviet deep battle tactics devastating. Where earlier encirclements had taken weeks and allowed escape corridors to remain open, Zhukov's forces completed their trap in less than a week. This was the first time since Stalingrad that the Soviets had successfully surrounded a major German force. But Stalingrad had taken months of grinding urban warfare before the encirclement succeeded. Korsun took 4 days. The Soviets had not just repeated their earlier success. They had refined it, systematized it, and turned encirclement from a desperate gamble into operational doctrine that could be deployed at will. But as the jaws of Zhukov's trap snapped shut around 60,000 German soldiers, one man, 1,500 miles away, would make the decision that transformed encirclement into annihilation. The pocket could have been evacuated. Corridors existed. Manstein's panzers were moving. But Hitler had other plans. In the critical first days after encirclement, when escape routes remained relatively open and the Soviet ring had not yet solidified, Hitler made a decision that sealed the fate of 60,000 men. He designated Korsun a fortress on the Dnieper. The terminology mattered. Fortresses hold. Fortresses do not retreat. Fortresses fight where they stand until relief arrives, or the enemy breaks. Hitler had used this same logic at Stalingrad, where the Sixth Army held its positions until it ceased to exist as a fighting force. Hitler's tactical interference went beyond symbolic declarations. He ordered the trapped forces to attempt a counter-encirclement operation against the Soviet spearheads. The idea was tactically absurd. The Germans inside the pocket had neither the numbers nor the mobility to envelop Soviet forces that outnumbered them nearly 7-1. But the order consumed precious days. Days when the pocket was still relatively intact. Days when organized withdrawal might have been possible. Days that would never return. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein understood what Hitler did not. Time was the enemy. Manstein commanded Army Group South and bore responsibility for the trapped divisions. He organized 2 major relief attempts to break through to the pocket from the outside. The first attempt broke through initial Soviet defenses on February 4th, but bogged down as atrocious weather combined with effective Soviet resistance. The terrain turned to mud. The advance stalled. Manstein reinforced and tried again. On February 11th, German armor launched a second, more heavily reinforced relief attempt. What followed was one of the great tank melees of the war. Hundreds of armored vehicles clashing across frozen fields in a desperate race to reach the pocket. Soviet and German tanks traded fire at ranges measured in hundreds of meters. Crews fought and died in steel boxes that offered protection from bullets but became coffins when penetrated by armor-piercing rounds. The battle raged for hours. The panzers never got closer than 25 miles to the pocket. 25 miles might as well have been 250. The trapped infantry could not march that distance through Soviet-controlled territory without being slaughtered. The relief force could not advance further without exposing itself to encirclement. The gap remained unbridgeable. By mid-February, the arithmetic of survival had become brutal. Supplies inside the pocket dwindled. Ammunition stocks fell. The wounded accumulated in field hospitals that lacked medicine and heat. Soviet forces tightened the ring. And 25 miles away, Manstein's exhausted panzers sat immobile, having spent their strength in failed attempts to close an impossible distance. By mid-February, with relief forces frozen 25 miles away and supplies exhausted, only one option remained, and it led straight through a killing ground the survivors would never forget. They charged into the night with bayonets fixed and a battle cry on their lips, 60,000 men betting everything on one desperate dash for freedom. Late in the evening of February 16th, the first German breakout echelon moved forward. Officers gave the order. Men fixed bayonets to rifles. The cry went up. Hurrah! They charged into the darkness, hoping speed and surprise would carry them through the Soviet lines before the defenders could organize effective resistance. For a brief moment, the gamble seemed to work. The initial assault caught Soviet forward positions unprepared. Germans pushed through the first defensive line. Then nature intervened with perfect timing for catastrophe. A furious blizzard struck the battlefield. Snow that had already accumulated a yard deep on the ground suddenly multiplied. Visibility collapsed to a few meters. The temperature plunged. Wind howled across the open steppe, driving snow horizontally into the faces of men trying to navigate by compass and desperation. Units lost contact with adjacent formations. Officers lost sight of their own men. The breakout column, which had maintained some semblance of organization during the initial charge, began to fragment into smaller groups stumbling through the storm. At precisely this moment, when 60,000 men needed leadership most desperately, command collapsed. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Stemmermann had organized relief forces moments earlier. He understood the terrain. He knew the plan. He was attempting to coordinate the breakout across multiple divisions when Soviet artillery found his position. A direct hit killed him instantly. One moment the trapped forces had a commander. The next moment they had a corpse and 60,000 leaderless soldiers in the middle of a Soviet killing zone. The breakdown of German command structure meant there was no one to coordinate the desperate mass of humanity pushing through the blizzard. Junior officers made decisions based on what they could see. which was almost nothing. Soldiers followed whoever seemed confident, which often meant following other lost men. The breakout, which had begun as a military operation with defined objectives and coordinated movements, degenerated into a mob fleeing through a storm toward a theoretical safety they could not see and might not reach. But as dawn broke on February 17th and the blizzard howled, the Soviets were waiting, and they had prepared something medieval. What happened next wasn't war, it was butchery. As the mass of German infantry approached the narrow corridor that survivors would name Hell's Gate, the hillside erupted with a roar. Soviet artillery, machine guns, and tank rounds slammed into the defenseless columns. The scene became pure horror. Men who had survived the initial charge, survived the blizzard, survived the night without their commander, now died by the hundreds as fire poured into the packed mass of humanity, trying to squeeze through the narrow escape route. Soviet tanks advanced directly into the German columns. Crews drove their vehicles over wagons, over the wounded lying on the ground, over men desperately trying to get away. The tanks crushed everything in their path. Steel treads ground flesh and bone into the frozen mud. Survivors described seeing wounded comrades disappear beneath advancing T-34s, their screams cut short by tons of metal. Then came something from another century entirely. The Soviet Fifth Guards Cavalry Corps charged into the German mass. Mounted soldiers rode down their victims and hacked away with their sabers. In 1944, with tanks and aircraft and artillery dominating the battlefield, men on horses killed with edged weapons. The cavalry charge succeeded because German cohesion had completely collapsed. The soldiers stumbling through Hell's Gate were not a military formation. They were individuals trying to survive. They had no mutual support. They had no coordinated defense. They had nothing except the hope that the next step would not be their last. The chaos was so complete that even Soviet forces suffered from fog of war. Red Army tanker Dmitry Loza recorded in his memoir that as tanks approached from the south, Soviet Shermans drove from the north, T-34 crews, unaware of the other Soviet forces' presence, set ablaze the tank of battalion commander Nikolai Nikolaevich Maslyukov, killing him. The Soviets were killing each other in the confusion of the slaughter, and still the carnage continued. More than 34% of the trapped German soldiers, over 20,000 men, did not survive the breakout attempt. 1 in 3 never made it through. They died in the snow, cut down by artillery fire, crushed beneath tank treads, sabered by cavalry, or simply frozen in the blizzard when wounds or exhaustion made further movement impossible. The casualty rate exceeded any acceptable military attrition. This was not a battle. This was the human cost of Hitler's no-retreat policy, measured in bodies that would lie frozen until spring. When the last survivors stumbled through German lines on February 18th, they brought news of a disaster. But the true catastrophe was only beginning. The 20,000 dead at Hell's Gate were only the beginning. Korsun-Cherkassy had broken something far larger than one pocket. The entire German defensive line in Ukraine unraveled in the immediate aftermath. The destruction of 2 corps created a gap that could not be plugged with available reserves. Divisions that might have held adjacent sectors had to shift to cover the hole left by the annihilated Korsun pocket. The front that had held through January suddenly fractured in February. Soviet forces poured through the gaps. In the north, the Soviets cleared the southern edge of the Pripyat marshes. Nothing stood between them and the Carpathian Mountains. The route toward Romania and Hungary lay open Germany's critical southeastern allies, the sources of oil that kept the Wehrmacht mobile, suddenly faced direct threat. In the south, Germans were forced from Krivoy Rog with its huge iron ore deposits and manganese reserves. These were not symbolic losses. Manganese was a key metal for military production, essential for steel and armor plate. The loss directly impacted Germany's ability to replace combat losses in tanks and equipment. The strategic consequences cascaded further. The retreat from the southern Dnieper made the defense of Crimea all but impossible. The narrow Perekop Isthmus connecting Crimea to the mainland could have been held by the forces destroyed at Korsun-Cherkassy. Without those divisions, the entire Crimean garrison faced eventual encirclement and destruction. The peninsula that Germany had fought to capture in 1941 and 1942 would be lost in 1944, and the seeds of that loss were planted in the snow outside Korsun. One encirclement triggered systematic collapse across hundreds of miles of front. The destruction of 60,000 men and the loss of 20,000 more in a single night's breakout attempt did not just eliminate two corps. It eliminated the reserves, the defensive depth, and the mobile forces needed to stabilize a fluid front. Soviet commanders recognized the opportunity, they pressed the advantage, and the entire German position in Ukraine, which had seemed stable in January, became untenable by March. But the most damning consequence of Korsun-Cherkassy wasn't what it destroyed in February 1944. It was what it revealed about what was coming. Every element of the disaster at Korsun-Cherkassy, Zhukov's coordination, the rapid encirclement, the fortress order, the failed relief, the breakout carnage, would repeat on a vastly larger scale in just 4 months. Korsun-Cherkassy demonstrated that the Soviets had mastered operational-level encirclement warfare. The multi-front coordination between Konev and Vatutin showed they could synchronize separate armies across vast distances. The overwhelming force ratios, 400,000 against 60,000, showed they could deploy numerical superiority with confidence. The rapid encirclement tempo, 4 days from attack to completed pocket, showed they had learned to move faster than German commanders could react. The ability to maintain both an inner ring containing the pocket and an outer ring. Blocking relief forces showed they had solved the logistical challenges that made encirclement operations so difficult. Every one of these capabilities would reappear at Operation Bagration. Marshal Zhukov's coordination of multiple fronts in a synchronized deep operation at Korsun was a direct rehearsal for his role coordinating the even more devastating multi-front encirclements that would destroy Army Group Center. The methods were identical. The scale would be larger. The outcome would be catastrophic. The battle also revealed the fatal consequences of Hitler's fortress policy and his refusal to authorize timely retreat. At Korsun, Hitler's order to hold in place wasted the critical days when escape corridors remained open. His order to attempt a counter-encirclement consumed time and resources that could have been used for organized withdrawal. His refusal to authorize breakout until the situation became desperate guaranteed that when the breakout finally occurred, it would happen under the worst possible conditions. Every one of these decisions would be repeated at Bagration, with even more disastrous results. Despite the clear warning that Soviet operational capabilities had reached a level that could systematically destroy German army groups, German high command failed to adapt defensive doctrine or override Hitler's no-retreat orders before facing Bagration. The lessons were visible. Officers who survived Hell's Gate carried those lessons back to German lines. They reported what they had seen. They described the coordination, the overwhelming force, the speed of encirclement, and the catastrophic cost of delayed breakout. Their warnings went unheeded at the command level where decisions were made. When Operation Bagration exploded across Belarusia on June 22, 1944, it wasn't a surprise. It was Korsun-Cherkassy multiplied by 10, and this time there would be no survivors to tell the tale of Hell's Gate. History remembers Stalingrad. History remembers Bagration. But the battle that connected them, the rehearsal that warned of everything to come, has been almost entirely forgotten. Korsun-Cherkassy occupies a strange middle ground in historical memory. It came too late to be grouped with Stalingrad's turning point narrative. The battle occurred in February 1944, when Germany's defeat was already inevitable to anyone analyzing production figures and force ratios. It came too early to be included in the final collapse story of 1944 and 1945. Bagration, which happened just 4 months later, overshadowed Korsun in both scale and strategic impact. The forgotten battle fell into the gap between the dramatic turning point and the final catastrophe. The battle also demonstrated every element that made Soviet deep operations devastating, yet it was small enough in scale that its lessons could be dismissed or ignored by German leadership as an aberration rather than a template. 60,000 men encircled was terrible, but not unprecedented. 20,000 casualties in the breakout was horrific, but not on the scale of Stalingrad's 300,000. The collapse of the Ukrainian front was serious, but not immediately fatal to Germany's ability to continue the war. Every metric suggested Korsun-Cherkassy was a significant defeat, but not a decisive catastrophe. This perception was catastrophically wrong. The battle's significance lay not in its immediate impact, but in what it revealed about Soviet capabilities and German vulnerabilities. Korsun-Cherkassy proved the Soviets could execute Stalingrad-style encirclements as operational doctrine. It proved Hitler's fortress policy would transform manageable withdrawals into massacres. It proved German relief forces could not break through Soviet blocking positions, even when the trapped pocket was relatively small. Every one of these lessons pointed toward Bagration, but the scale of Korsun was small enough that German high command could avoid confronting the implications. The 34% casualty rate and the horror of Hell's Gate matched or exceeded the intensity of more famous encirclements. Yet the battle lacks the symbolic weight of Stalingrad or the strategic decisiveness of Bagration in popular understanding. For the soldiers who survived Hell's Gate, stumbling through blizzards while cavalry sabered their comrades and artillery turned snow red, Korsun-Cherkassy was anything but forgotten. But their warnings went unheeded at the command level where strategic decisions were made. Perhaps Korsun-Cherkassy remains forgotten precisely because remembering it makes the catastrophe of Bagration even more inexcusable. The warning was clear, the lessons were written in blood, and no one listened. So why does Korsun-Cherkassy matter? Because it was the moment when the Eastern Front's outcome became inevitable, and everyone who needed to see it looked away. Korsun-Cherkassy was the moment the Soviets proved they could replicate Stalingrad's encirclement not once, not accidentally, but systematically as operational doctrine that could be deployed at will. The 4-day encirclement tempo, the multi-front coordination, the overwhelming force ratios, and the ability to maintain both inner and outer rings simultaneously demonstrated that the Red Army had evolved from the desperate defender of 1941 into an offensive juggernaut that could execute complex operations with precision. This was not the Soviet Union barely surviving. This was the Soviet Union demonstrating mastery of operational art. The battle's 34% casualty rate in the Hell's Gate breakout demonstrated the human cost of Hitler's fortress policy more clearly than any other single engagement between Stalingrad and Bagration. 20,000 men died in a single night because Hitler refused to authorize retreat when escape was still possible. The direct causal line between Hitler's order to hold in place and the bodies piled in the snow could not have been clearer. Every staff officer analyzing the battle could see that timely withdrawal would have saved those lives. But Hitler's authority remained absolute, and his policy remained unchanged. Marshal Zhukov's coordination at Korsun-Cherkassy was the direct operational rehearsal for his role at Bagration. The same commander used the same methods to achieve the same multi-front coordination, but with lessons learned and refined. The encirclement at Korsun took 4 days. The encirclements at Bagration would take less. The force ratios at Korsun were 5-to-1. At Bagration, they would be even higher. Zhukov took everything that worked at Korsun and scaled it up for the destruction of Army Group Center. The immediate strategic collapse across Ukraine after Korsun-Cherkassy, the unraveling of the entire front, loss of critical resources, and exposure of Allied flanks, previewed exactly how Bagration would shatter Army Group Center and open the road to Berlin I encirclement, created cascading failures across hundreds of miles. The loss of reserves, defensive depth, and mobile forces meant adjacent sectors could not hold. The pattern was clear. The warning was explicit, and 4 months later, the same pattern would repeat on a scale that destroyed an entire German army group and killed or captured 450,000 soldiers. The story of Korsun-Cherkassy is ultimately the story of a warning ignored, 60,000 men encircled, 20,000 dead in the snow, an entire front collapsed, and 4 months later, when Bagration destroyed Army Group Center and killed or captured 450,000 German soldiers, no one could say they hadn't been warned. Hell's Gate had shown them exactly what was coming. Korsun-Cherkassy stands as the forgotten little Stalingrad, the battle where the Soviets proved they had mastered the operational art of encirclement, where Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat transformed manageable withdrawal into Hell's Gate carnage, and where every element of the coming catastrophe at Bagration was rehearsed and revealed. The 34% who died in the snow, cut down by cavalry sabers and artillery in a blizzard, paid the price for lessons that would go unlearned. Their deaths demonstrated with mathematical precision what happened when encirclement combined with delayed breakout. Their suffering showed what Hitler's fortress policy meant in human terms. Their sacrifice bought knowledge that could have prevented an even greater catastrophe. When we ask how 450,000 German soldiers could be encircled and destroyed at Bagration just 4 months later, the answer lies in the frozen killing ground outside Korsun-Cherkassy, where the warning was written in blood, and no one with the power to act chose to read it. Zhukov showed his methods. Hitler revealed his inflexibility. The combination proved fatal, and the pattern repeated because the lesson went unlearned. History forgot Korsun-Cherkassy, but the men who died there bought the knowledge that could have prevented an even greater catastrophe. That their sacrifice was ignored makes this forgotten battle not just tragic, but unforgivable. 20,000 men died, showing exactly what would happen at Bagration. The warning could not have been clearer. The cost could not have been higher. And when the catastrophe came in June 1944, destroying Army Group Center and opening the road to Berlin, the ghosts of Hell's Gate could have told them they had seen it all before. The blizzard that struck on February 16, 1944, eventually cleared. The bodies frozen in the snow eventually thawed. But the lesson written in blood and cavalry charges and artillery fire remained, waiting for someone with the authority and courage to read it. No one did. And so, Korsun-Cherkassy remains what it has always been, the forgotten rehearsal for the catastrophe that ended Nazi Germany's ability to defend the Eastern Front. History may have forgotten the name, but the pattern it revealed, encirclement, delay, breakout, slaughter, became the template for Soviet victory. The 20,000 who died at Hell's Gate deserved better than to be forgotten. They deserved to be the warning that was heeded. Instead, they became the prologue to an even greater tragedy, proof that sometimes the most important battles are the ones history chooses to ignore. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.